Welcome to Free Kiwis. Today it's just James and me talking about the saga of the Victoria University Free Speech Panel. Now, as listeners may know, there was a panel scheduled for early this week, but it was postponed following student complaints about right-wing voices on the panel, by which they seem to have meant myself and Jonathan. Now, both of us may dispute that we are in fact right-wing. However it is, the panel has now been reconvened for late May, and in fact it is now two panels. There's one that seems to comprise what they call activists and another what they call academics. Jonathan will be on the first of those panels and I will be on the second. So, James, I thought it was a good chance to kind of catch up and talk through some of the issues with the postponement and the way they've reconfigured it. And to be charitable to Nic Smith, the Vice-Chancellor, at least he's held the line on having Jonathan involved, which seemed to be the main point of contention for many of the complainers.
Yeah, okay, you could give him kind of a B+ in that sense, that he hasn't, cancelled or deplatformed the two token speakers who are from the center-right. But, he's essentially gotten rid of the first panel, which I think had a kind of 2-2 left-right split, with Nicole Moram being a kind of unknown or neutral because no one seems to have any idea of her political views. And he's replaced that with these two panels, which have 10 people in total. And if you remove Nicole Moram again as a neutral or someone whose political views we don't really know about, then I see that split as 7-2.
Yeah.
So what's happened, in my reading, what's happened is this. Nic Smith said, we're going to have a mature, grown-up discussion about free speech, and we're going to make sure it's balanced because we're a public university and we're using public funds and we have a responsibility for neutrality or balance to some extent. So we're going to have this panel, we're inviting people from these other organizations, and then what happened is that a small number of vocal student activists basically used emotional manipulation to get at him and to say, we're freaking out about the right-wing voices, right? And what he did is to cave into that. He didn't cave in to the extent that he got rid of Jonathan Ailing and you from the panels completely, from the event completely. But he did cave in to the extent that he did exactly what one of the things that the activists wanted, which was to make the panel more unbalanced, right?
Yes.
It's very interesting because on Twitter, after the first panel was postponed, a lot of people were saying, oh, it's fine, they just wanted to make the panel more balanced. And in fact, they've done the opposite. They've made it less balanced, right? And this just shows that the way the university is set up now, the way the universities are in New Zealand, and in fact, much of the Anglophone world, there's this huge, overwhelming left-right skew. And we know that. We can see that through simple surveys of academics' political views. And so what happens in these situations is that these administrators are faced with all of these complaints from the left, some from the far left. Usually it's the more extreme people who dominate the conversation, because the people who are more inclined to kind of kick off emotionally and stuff like that, they tend to dominate these conversations. And the people who are sort of more to the center left, they tend to go with it because they're all on the same side and they kind of sympathize with the ideology. They're not inclined to kind of stand up to these people because that might make them look like they're moderate or something, right? And that's the kind of kiss of death in academia. So they go along with it. So I sort of do sympathize with Nic Smith to that extent. But it's obvious what he's supposed to do. He's being paid $300,000 a year. He's essentially, heading this public institution which receives public funds and has various duties to free speech and to be kind of fair-minded politically. And he's failing.
Yeah, so I think we'll get on to some of the specifics of the way in which the panel has changed and the extent to which that may be a compromising of the duty of the university to uphold free debate. But first of all, I want to trouble the notion that left and right is the right spectrum on which to be seeing this in the first place. I mean, I suppose compared with an average academic, I might be characterised as right-wing, but it's not a label that I adopt myself. And I would say that on social issues, I'm extremely liberal. On economics, I'm probably less so or more market-oriented or whatever. Not that I'm an economist, and it's not something that I focus on in my professional life. But if we look traditionally or historically, it's actually been the left of politics that has tended to be the champions of free speech, at least in the mid to late 20th century, and that now seems to have shifted. But really, surely, when you're looking for balance on a panel about free speech, the relevant balance ought to be opinions about free speech, not one's fundamental political orientation.
I suppose. I mean, it's difficult because I think that with a lot of these people, I think that they're essentially anti-free speech, but they don't often say that, right? They usually say, "Oh, we're all for free speech. It's just that you can't say anything that I disagree with." I mean, that's effectively what I think their argument is, right?
Yeah.
Or there's some kind of slightly more sophisticated version of that. It's like you can say whatever you want as long as there are things that they aren't harmful or something, which to my mind is just another way of saying things that I don't disagree with strongly or something of that sort. So it's kind of tough because I don't think there are many people out there who are explicitly, openly against free speech. So, I mean, so everyone in the panel, I think, will probably pay lip service to it, right?
Probably, and some people will say free speech isn't hate speech and whatever they mean by hate speech should be banned or whatever. But my point is that if you're looking for balance on a panel, then it should be balanced with respect to whatever the topic under discussion is rather than something else, such as one's political orientation. And I would say that neither the left nor the right has a monopoly on being either pro or anti-free speech, because you can find people on both sides of politics who might be either.
I think that that's true. I mean, sort of theoretically, I think that at the moment, the current moment of the culture wars, as it's called, the left, I mean, the contemporary sort of university left or the woke left.
As opposed to the old style, perhaps socialist left. I think of commentators like Chris Trotter and my friend Barley Hark, who would both be, with us on free speech.
Yeah, but those people are marginalized. I think Chris Trotter for the average Vic undergraduate now is some kind of right-winger. I mean, they will happily denounce, if they've even heard of him.
Well, that's why I think this is just a useless label.
I'm not sure it's a useless label because I think it does sort of describe some aspect of reality at a very simple level. Like if you're going to make a division of political views into 2 rather than like 3 or 17, it might have a certain amount of force, but might make a certain amount of sense. But what I was going to say is just that at the current moment in the culture wars, it does seem like we're settling into this split of people sort of broadly on the right are now, kind of surprisingly for people of our generation or my generation and yours, more sort of pro-free speech in the real sense than people on the left. So there is kind of this split that like people more on the left tend to be saying, yes, free speech, but, basically no free speech that I disagree with, or that goes against the kind of orthodox view of things. And people on the right tend to be more kind of pro-free speech in the old classical, in the old liberal sense, right? And so I do kind of think it's a relevant relevant way of looking at this. But I think even if we use some kind of different categories, like we just focused on this free speech issue in the way I've been saying, like who has a more classical liberal view of free speech? You and Jonathan Ayling, and then the other ones, as far as I can tell, we don't know, I guess, in every instance until they talk. But some of them they have. We can look at their art, and we've looked at these people online and looked at some of the articles they published and stuff, and it seems like they're basically all on the woke left. I mean, we can look at we should probably do this a bit more carefully. So I'll just read out the names. So, well, if people haven't been following this at all, maybe we should say, okay, the Vice-Chancellor organized this panel on free speech at Victoria University of Wellington. On the first panel, there were going to be 5 speakers, and these were Jane Kelsey, Emeritus Professor of Law at the University of Auckland, Dr. John Byron, Principal Policy Advisor to the Vice-Chancellor at Queensland University of Technology, Professor Nicole Moram, teaches law at Victoria, Dr. Michael Johnston, Senior Fellow at New Zealand Initiative, former Associate Dean of Education at Victoria, Jonathan Ayling, Chief Executive of New Zealand's Free Speech Union. Yeah, so I think that's basically a 2-2 split with Nicole Moram. Various people have been kind of scrawling everybody's university pages in the last few days, and no one seems to have a clear idea of what Nicole Moram's political ideas are, which is actually kind of nice from a professor nowadays. But Otherwise, I would say the reason I'll just briefly justify this. The reason why I put John Byron in a left-wing box is because I've heard that he worked as an advisor to Labour ministers in the past. So it may not be that he's
we don't know what his
particularly
views on free
extreme or what
speech
his views. Yeah, okay, but I think it's sort of fair to put him in that box. Jane Kelsey, I would say, is more woke left. I'm not saying she shouldn't speak or whatever, but I think that's a fair description. She's kind of broadly postmodern left, I think, if you look at some of her past publications. And yeah, I mean, so Michael Johnston, I mean, you say you're not right wing. I think that just for the broad purposes of categorization, I think that most people would say someone who's a classical liberal or libertarian interested nowadays is more right than left. I also think that's kind of weird.
Well, my problem with that is that it puts one in the same political category, albeit perhaps purportedly on a different part of the spectrum, as extreme right-wing people like fascists. Now, that to me is just wrong, because a classical liberal, and certainly a libertarian-leaning classical liberal, has no agreement with fascists about anything. So it doesn't make any kind of sense, and it becomes a potentially almost defamatory confusion.
Well, I understand that. I mean, I think that you're not on the authoritarian right. That's very clear. You're an anti-authoritarian. I mean, this is something that we share. I mean, it's partly why we're doing the Free Kiwis podcast, why we've done it. But I think that at least over the past, let's say, 40 years, like since the 1980s at least, people who broadly, I would say, I think that most moderates in liberal democratic societies value both freedom and equality to some extent. The question is like, how you implement those things and what they mean to you. But I would say that broadly since the 80s, people who would emphasize freedom over equality are seen as being on the right. Freedom in terms of economic freedoms in terms of markets, in terms of civil liberties used to be a more lefty thing, but definitely economic freedom was a right-wing thing. And now it's like the libertarian and classical liberal right are kind of the only people who are defending civil liberties as well. And the left-wing people have been the people who have emphasized equality.
Right, but I would dispute the meaning of the word equality in that case, because I believe in fundamental equality, which is why I champion civil liberties like free speech, because I think everybody should be equally able to speak.
Yeah, that's the same as me, yeah.
Right. So what do we mean by favouring freedom over equality? Because to me, freedom and equality they're not opposed values.
Yeah, I mean, this goes deep into sort of political theory. I mean, this is something that Ronald Dworkin, the great sort of philosopher of law, argued that freedom and equality kind of flow into one another. And I can see the idea of that, but I mean...
Well, as our societies have become freer since the Enlightenment, they've also become more equal, and I don't think that's a coincidence. I think the idea of political equality, where everybody gets a vote, is part of that. I think the idea of universal education, where in theory at least everybody gets a good high quality education at taxpayers' expense, serves both freedom and equality of opportunity in adulthood. I certainly think that the civil liberties movement of the mid to late 20th century delivered better equality and better freedom for women, for Black Americans, for Māori here in New Zealand, and so on. So, again, I can't actually see those values, at least according to my definitions of them, as being in opposition.
Since the 1980s, though, I mean, a lot of people argue that with the sort of Thatcher and Reagan revolution and Rogernomics here, there's been an increase in economic freedom, and that's gone hand in hand with an increase in inequality.
In economic inequality.
Economic inequality. It's arguable.
That's probably arguable.
It's arguable. Yeah. I mean, there's a New Zealand Initiative report by Bryce Wilkinson, and Janessa Jeram, I think, which is well worth reading, where they argue that there hasn't actually been that big an increase in inequality in New Zealand. But part of their argument in that report is that they contrast that with what's happened in the States. So it seems clear that in the States, at least, there was an increase in inequality. So, I mean, that's one area where you can see, it seems kind of crude, but in some areas you can see that when you get more freedom, you get less equality. But, I mean, I think that we don't have to kind of litigate that. I mean, I just think that in terms of the description of people's political views, I think that's been the kind of sense That's been one of the ways. So in other words, there is a non-authoritarian right. Like people think that there is a non-authoritarian right, which is basically libertarians. I mean, I would prefer to call myself, I don't know where I am exactly. I think I always thought of myself as a centrist or liberal Democrat. To the extent that I'm on the right, I would prefer to think of myself as the liberal right.
Yep.
Because for me, a libertarian is someone who is even more devoted to liberty, in very strong ways. And I'm a bit more fuzzy than that. But anyway, maybe as you get back to the panels and stuff.
Because the other thing about balance that's worth noting is that irrespective of the question about left and right, they've moved from a panel that was quite balanced in its views, or arguably balanced in its views on the topic at discussion, to one that is heavily slanted one way.
That's right. So what I said at the beginning, they basically got 10 people now. They've got these two panels, and I think it's a 7-2 left-right split. I mean, if you want to use your terms, I mean, I think they were probably saying the same thing. I think if we looked at them in terms of their views of free speech, even though we don't really know ahead of time in every case, we could probably guess with a fair degree of accuracy. But I'll read out the sort of renewed panels, the reform panels. So this is an email from Nic Smith, and he says there's going to be two panels. The first part, in interview format, will enable advocates and commentators with differing perspectives to share their experience and thoughts. I don't think there's going to be questions in that session, so that's an interesting point as well. But the lineup includes, it says, that's interesting. Might not be everybody who's involved. But anyway, Anjan Ramon, sorry about the mispronunciation, project founder, Inclusive Aotearoa Collective. Okay, I mean, I don't mean to take the piss, because that's fine. You're welcome to have a collective called that. It's interesting, but that's clearly a left-wing organization, right?
Yes.
Professor Linda Johnston, Rainbow Community Advocate and founding member of Hamilton Pride. So again, like, she may be a classical liberal on free speech. I mean, in my view, the best thing for gay people and lesbian people and transsexuals and transvestites is to defend free speech. I think it's the best thing for them. But in the current political climate,
they tend not to.
The people who are supposedly speaking on behalf of those people tend not to be in favor of free speech, which is weird, but that's the way it is. Morgan Godfrey, Maori political commentator and Victoria University of Wellington senior law lecturer. I mean, that's someone who apparently he's off Twitter now, or X. He used to have a large Twitter following, and that made it clear. And he writes for he occasionally writes columns and stuff, and the Dominion, the Post, a former Dominion Post, and he's fairly clearly left wing, and also I think fairly clearly in this kind of woke basket. And one of the key features of the woke left, in my view, is precisely that they don't like free speech.
Yeah.
Right.
In fact, I would say that they're authoritarian, so to the extent that they're left-wing, they're the authoritarian left.
Yeah, although even then, like, I agree that they're an authoritarian left, but they're not the Stalinist old authoritarian left.
No, they're not.
They're not like machine gun everyone with glasses. They're like passive-aggressively use emotional manipulation in order to shut down people you disagree with and get people cancelled and fired and stuff. Left, yeah. Dr. John Byron. This is the one Australian University. We talked about him already. We don't know too much, to be fair, but I mean, it seems like he moves in left-wing circles. Again, I'm not saying this like we need to sort of tar him and feather him or something. It's just, that's a point of description, that he seems to be more on the left than the right. And then Jonathan Ayling, and someone said today at the initiative, well, Jonathan Ayling, he's not really right-wing either, because he's just defending free speech. And I kind of agree, like, the Free Speech Union is not a right-wing organization. I genuinely believe that. I mean, maybe sociologically you can say that more of the people in them are from the right, but actually...
Maybe. It's not clear.
Exactly. I mean, there's like Annie O'Brien probably would be on the right now, but she didn't used to be.
Chris Trotter, exactly.
Dane Giroux is definitely still on the left, right? I do think it's fair... Maybe Jonathan Ayling will comment or write in or something, hopefully, but I do think it's fair to say he's on the right, just because I think that he's worked in the past for politicians in the National Party. So on the same basis that I am categorizing John Byron as left.
I think the important thing to emphasise is the Free Speech Union, contrary to the assertions of some of its critics, have defended the free speech of people who might be associated with left-wing causes whenever that has arisen, which, as you noted, is less often just because of the moment in the culture war.
Yeah. But I mean, they defended, for example, drag queen story hours as
They did, and a
lot of conservatives dislike that.
They opposed the idea of banning gang patches.
Exactly. So like this is the thing. So traditional conservatives who'd be more concerned with, I don't know, like more traditional interpretations of human sex and sexuality, which they're entitled to. But I think a lot of them have kind of a little bit lost the plot is too strong, but I think a lot of them have kind of compromised their commitment to free speech on the drag queen issue in my view.
It so often happens, doesn't it? For people,
it's hard to do.
People like free speech for things that they agree with.
Yeah. And it's the same with the gang patches, arguably, that they don't like gangs, and that's kind of leached into their view of people wearing patches, which for me and for the Free Speech Union is really just what you're wearing rather than what you're doing, right? Like criminal behavior, I think, should be criminalized, or should be considered criminal, and you should take steps to kind of stop it and put people in prison or charge them with whatever there's evidence for. But wearing a particular type of clothing, for me, that's not a crime, right? So anyway, I think the Free Speech Union is right on that, and they have done a very good job, I think. I mean, we're supporters, but I think we'd be less strong supporters of the Free Speech Union if they were just a kind of right-wing
Correct.
group, right?
Yeah.
Because free speech is too important to really just be.
Well, I mean, the acid test is whether you stand up for it for your opponents.
That's right, yeah. Okay, then the second part, says Nic Smith, will be a panel discussion with academics who will be sharing their reflections of the first discussion, considering the implications for universities and exploring how we can more constructively hold challenging conversations for the benefit of society. I think you're right that Nic Smith deserves some credit for even using this kind of language, right? Which is obviously right, but a lot of people think it isn't nowadays. So this lineup includes, so may not be the complete list, but Emeritus Professor Jane Kelsey, University of Auckland, we talked about her already. She's pretty clearly on the woke left. Not like a terrible thing, but that's true, I think. Professor Kylie Quince, Dean of Law, Auckland University of Technology. So she works in sort of Maori law stuff.
Law, yep.
I would say, like, in terms of her public profile that I found, I wouldn't say it's affectively very strong. Like, I don't think she's
not a great activist.
I don't think she comes across as sort of an activist more than a scholar, which is nice to see. But I think that it's fair to say that some of her intellectual concerns are feminist and Maori, and that's more left and more woke left than not, right? So Dr. Michael Johnston, talked about him. And Nicole Morum, again, we don't know much about her, and Professor Richard Arnold. So you know Richard Arnold?
I know Richard a little bit. He's a statistician at the university, and I would say politically he's on the left. I certainly wouldn't like to characterise him as being on the woke left because I don't really know his views in depth. He may well be a traditional lefty.
Yeah.
I think he's been involved with the Tertiary Education Union. I'm sorry, Richard, if I've got that wrong. But,
well, people can write in and tell us that we're wrong about everything, as usual. But, I mean, again, like, I think that what we're saying here isn't, we're freaking out over these people because they're left-wing or woke and they have to be off the panel and we can't stand to be in the room with them. You're not saying that you won't debate them, right?
Certainly not. In fact, I'm looking forward to it. And I think at least with the second panel, as far as I can see, most people on it, if not all, will debate in a nicely kind of convivial manner. So hopefully it will be a really productive discussion.
Yeah.
But, the final point I'd like to make about balance is that it seems that what they're really concerned with is balance in terms of representing as many different purported minorities or oppressed minorities as they can, including Māori and Rainbow and so on. In fact, they've made that fairly explicit in some of the communications they've had with me. And so, again, that seems to me not necessarily the relevant dimension of balance for a panel discussion on free speech.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was going to make something like that point. I mean, the point I was going to make is just that, you can say we need representation from different groups, different minorities, but the groups that you will choose will also depend on the way you look at the world and your political views. So, and this is a classic case where, because everybody at the university is left-wing or far left, the only option for the new groups that they were going to invite were going to be groups that the left and the far left see as really important, right? The way they see the world is divided into these identity categories. And some of these identity categories clearly exist, but there are all sorts of other groups with which someone else looking at this issue from a more balanced perspective might think should be involved. For example, for a panel on free speech, why don't we have journalists? Why don't we have filmmakers? Why don't we have pornographers? Well, there are whole groups. Why don't we have different types of libertarians? There are lots of different types of classical liberal and libertarians, right?
You'd need a panel of thousands to represent all of the possible dimensions.
There's a classic case, like, because there's this massive demographic skew in terms of the politics of university, there aren't anybody there who are making these points.
And I think it goes to one of the important substantive problems for free speech at the moment, which is that certain characteristics are held to be in some sense sacred. You can't criticise certain points of view that are associated with the purported rights of oppressed minorities. And that is actually one of the big problems that we're facing. So, you take, for example, the Mātauranga Māori in the science curriculum debate. And so much of the criticism of the Listener 7 and the people who said that we shouldn't mix Mātauranga Māori and science in the curriculum has been along the lines of, it's racist to say that, you don't understand, you can't possibly understand what Mātauranga Māori is, and you have no right to speak on it. I mean, that's a paraphrasing and maybe not entirely fair, but it's along those lines. It's not a rational kind of debate where people lay out their arguments and compare them and try to be fair to the other side.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, another group of people that maybe should be spoken for or have a representative is Christians. So, I mean, when I was at the university, I heard a lot of very sort of cutting, dismissive remarks about Christians, which maybe it's not oppression, but it's oppression to the extent that people complain about oppression at university. It often involves just like things people say and stuff, right? So, to the extent that anyone's oppressed at the modern university, which is sort of dubious, Christians are surely, one of them, and they're underrepresented.
They'd certainly be marginalised.
Yeah, so we needed a representative of like 3 different forms of evangelical Christianity, right? Because they're not all the same.
Yeah, well, when I was an undergraduate at Monash, I think there were about 8 different Christian clubs of different descriptions, from the liberal to the conservative.
And they're obviously affected by free speech issues, right? Because there was the case that the Free Speech Union took a few years ago about Bethlehem College. There have been a few cases of people basically
there's the recent case in Wellington with the anti-abortion protester.
That's right. That's a good example.
Who was arrested for using, rhetoric, I would say, when he said, in response to somebody who said abortion is a good thing because there are too many people on the planet, he said, well, maybe you should lead the way by knocking yourself off then. And he was arrested for saying that.
I wouldn't even say that's rhetoric. That's just like a political point. It's like a vibrant way of putting a political point. Like he's trying to say, I think that the consequences of your view, if you followed them through to the full, would be that you should kill yourself. Which I think actually, if all the person said is we need to reduce the population, maybe they have a more nuanced view. But if that's all they said in that instance, that seems like a fair response. Anyway, even if we think it's not a fair response, it's a free country. People are allowed to say what they want.
And he was clearly not seriously suggesting
that
this person ought to go and commit suicide.
Yeah.
So now I think another point that's worth raising here is that the discussion was to be held in the hub, and they had some 600 people interested in coming, whereas now it's to be held in a lecture theatre with a maximum capacity of 350. Now you can see why they've done that, because some of the activists threatened to protest, and we've seen some of the ways in which their protests can play out, in particular at the Auckland Domain last year when Posey Parker tried to speak and she was physically attacked and other people were physically attacked by the protesters. So you can understand why the university might want to have it in a slightly more secure area. But I do think that it compromises things potentially. I mean, for one thing, it looks as if you can only now register to attend if you're an academic staff member or perhaps a student, presumably a member of the university community, shall we say. And as you've observed, that community tends to lean in a particular direction. So one might say that perhaps inadvertently the audience will now be stacked with a particular orientation.
Yeah. I mean, this is the issue, is that the university should be an institution that serves the whole of New Zealand and is fair-minded. It doesn't have to be neutral on every issue, because in some cases the evidence will lead in one direction rather than the other. But I think it does need to make an effort to say we're open to all New Zealanders, and if you have right-wing views, for example, if people are disturbed by that, then that's their problem. Like, we're going to just make sure that this is a forum for all people's views anyway, and people can engage with us. And if there's students in the classroom, and if they're outside intellectuals, they can come in and talk, because we want to make this a space where the students are exposed to different ideas, right? That should happen. That should be what the university is doing. But it's not happening because there's this enormous political skew. And I think that, to put this in context, so what Nic Smith is doing, he's relatively recently minted as a Vice-Chancellor, right? He came in, last year?
Yes.
And so he's obviously thinking, to his credit, right, it's hard to tell how sincere he is, I have to say, but to his credit, at least, let's say this, he's paying lip service to free speech. So let's imagine he's very sincere and he wants to actually defend proper free speech.
Taking a charitable view is good.
Taking a charitable view is good. I mean, I think that in this case, there's a chance also that these people will sort of pull the wool over our eyes and say, we're doing free speech stuff. Look, we're protecting free speech. Like the guidelines that they put out over public discourse conversations. Yeah. We have an article out in the Post about those. I mean, those are clearly, I think, going to undermine if they came in, they would undermine free speech rather than promote it.
I agree.
And this is all under the guise of promoting free speech. But let's imagine that Nic Smith, let's imagine Nic Smith takes our criticisms on board. He really is sincerely in favor of free speech. So he's trying to sort of change the atmosphere. And if we put this in context, it's not just one panel, right? This is partly why we're talking about it so much. It's not just that there's this one panel. It's also that we're writing a report on academic freedom in New Zealand. And we've got lots of testimonies from academics, and we've got all these episodes that have happened over the past few years, from deplatforming of Don Brash, the Speak Up for Women event, and lots of other things which actually haven't come to light yet, haven't been reported on, where people have come to us and said, this happened to me at university. So, and also we've got all this evidence from surveys, like the Free Speech Union and Heterodox New Zealand, this group of academics, they surveyed academics and undergraduates, and all three of those surveys tell the same story, which is that people feel inhibited to discuss certain issues.
Yep.
So there's actually like a mountain of stuff that if Nic Smith is really sincere, he's going to have to deal with all that. And it's going to take a lot of thinking, a lot of thought, and a lot of action to do this.
It'd be very difficult. Even if he was, as committed to free speech as you and I, he would have an immense task ahead of him. And he probably faces at least some opposition from within his own senior management team. He certainly faces it from a preponderance of his staff and an overwhelming preponderance of the students.
Yeah, I mean, my experience of Vic was definitely that the higher ups in the sort of chain of command, they understand and are committed to free speech even less, I would say, than most of the students and staff.
Yeah,
which is pretty chilling, and don't really.
And to be fair to the students, a lot of them probably haven't really thought about it.
Yeah, and it's always a possibility in these cases that you don't really know everybody's views, because they're dominated by these vocal minorities who will basically bully you if you do stand up for free speech or just
and claim that they speak for everybody.
Yeah. So I mean, you're a bit more charitable to Nic Smith, I think, in this situation, but I think here, what he's done. Okay, yes, he hasn't kicked you and Jonathan Ailing and off the panels completely, and you're going to still take part.
I think especially retaining Jonathan is worthy of credit, because that was the thing that people were going to protest about. He was the one who apparently was primarily unsafe for students. I mean,
then this whole guilt by association tactics thing, where it's like he protected someone's free speech rights who said something we don't like. So that doesn't mean he agrees.
They've held the line on that, but I do think that it's now fallen into a situation where the panel is less balanced than it was on the issue at hand.
Yeah,
and I also think that it's very unfortunate that far fewer people will be able to attend, and that attending will be contingent on being a member of the university.
But my main problem, I think, is just this dynamic. This episode illustrates a dynamic that I've seen time and time again at Vic and other universities, which is that the person who's in charge, I mean, I'm not like a big authoritarian, as you know. I'm kind of radically democratic in some ways, but the person who's meant to be kind of protecting and serving this public institution has a clear duty to basically defend free speech and balance. And what's happened is that not even like all the students, like a few very bolshy vocal students.
And possibly some off-campus pressure groups as well.
Possibly some within the staff as well, whatever. But there's probably not a majority, like a minority of people have just gone at him and said, we feel emotional or whatever, which is not an argument, right? It's like, well, okay, I have strong emotions in favor of free speech and political neutrality. So why don't I get to kind of, change the group just because I said I feel that way. But so Nic Smith, I think, instead of just ignoring that or pushing back against it, he's actually caved into that on this point, that he's actually agreed to make the panel less representative in terms of politics. Or if you want to put it this way, he's agreed to make it representative in this very far left way and not in any other way. And I think that that's bad. And people may be thinking, well, come on, it's just one panel. It's not that big a deal. But it's frustrating because you see this time and time again. And every time it happens, the crazy people become emboldened, right? Because
that's true.
Because it incentivizes them.
Their behavior.
It's classic. This is something you've taught me, I think. This is like classic psychology, right? Is that you give a positive feedback to a behavior and it encourages that behavior, reinforces it, right?
Classical conditioning, yeah.
So this is going to happen again and again, because next time there's something like this, everyone will think, oh, remember last time we kicked up a fuss and we said that we were freaking out at right-wing voices, and it worked, so let's do it again. And then it not only means that they win, which is sort of unjust, it incentivizes them being increasingly emotional, right? Which is not what you want to incentivize at university. You want to incentivize people to be increasingly reasonable and rational. And
I would say that anybody who is an educator of young people at present ought to be focused on calming down the way in which discourse takes place and trying to educate people in reason and evidence, and not to privilege their emotions when it comes to arguing.
Yeah. So, I mean, my big takeaway from this is something I sort of come to this conclusion anyway, but I think that just makes it spectacularly clear, is that if you're a sort of ordinary New Zealander and you're interested in having universities that you pay tax money towards that actually kind of serve the country rather than are used as a kind of left-wing pressure group to a large extent, this shows that the universities themselves are not going to be able to reform themselves. Nic Smith, and you can have a new Vice-Chancellor come in,
right.
And he can have the support of people higher up in politics or whatever, but he on himself in this role is not going to be able to do anything, because everyone he interacts with is on the left to the far left, and that's the problem.
Yeah.
So it has to be government legislation.
I mean, especially in a reasonably democratic institution like a university, the leader exerts some influence, but they don't change the culture fundamentally, especially when, like the university, that organisation is part of a very wide network of organisations that are all like that. So
yeah, exactly.
One university leader has no chance of turning around the culture,
because the peer pressure comes in that form, right? It doesn't come from like people they don't want to hang out with are not going to affect them. It's more like Nic Smith probably, I don't know if he hangs out with them, but like he sees as his peer group other vice-chancellors in Australasian universities and Anglophone universities, and they're probably all sort of, there's some signs of a pushback in the other direction in some American universities, but broadly they're all sort of in this anti-free speech school, right?
Yeah, that's very much true. So anyway, it would be nice if we could invite our listeners to come along to this event, but it looks like we can't, because it's going to be restricted to university staff and students as far as I can tell. But I do think they'll record it, so at least you can look out for it online. And we'd encourage you to tune in and have a listen and see what you think.
Yeah, and I guess the final thing I'd say on this is just that I really find it amazing that universities have decided to pursue this suicidal course precisely at a time when sort of new media and podcasting and online stuff is really, it's possible like never before, and it's really ramping up and becoming successful. So I'm happy we're doing podcasting and stuff like that, because I just think this may be the future. I mean, hopefully, I think that already, like anyone to the right of centre in New Zealand, they may think, oh, I kind of have to send my kid to university for career reasons, but they're probably at this point just thinking these institutions are just kind of corrupted, and just in the sense that they're not doing what the public money is supposed to be going for.
They're not upholding their legislated duty.
Exactly, yeah. So I'd say, keep tuning into Free Kiwis, keep exploring online options for learning and discussion, because it's very difficult at the moment in universities.
Indeed.